The snowstorm had swallowed the road ahead, turning everything into a blur of white. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, squinting through the thick snowfall. He had been on the road for nearly 10 hours, exhausted but determined to reach his next stop before dawn. The dispatcher had warned him about road closures, but he didn't have time for detours. He decided to take a lesser-known route through the back road, hoping to shave an hour off his trip. The moment he turned onto the narrow road, something felt wrong. The trees loomed tall and skeletal, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The snowfall thickened, muffling all sound except for the steady hum of his truck. He adjusted the radio, but it only crackled with static. A deep unease settled in his gut, but he brushed it off. Then he saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, barely visible through the storm. His heart pounded as he slammed the brakes, his tires skidding over the ice. But in the split second it took for him to blink, the figure was gone. His breath caught in his throat. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there at all. He exhaled shakily and shook his head. Maybe he was just seeing things. He was tired after. Further down the road, he spotted an old gas station, its single flickering light barely illuminating the lot. His fuel was running low, so he pulled in, stepping out into the cold. Inside, the station was eerily quiet. An old man sat behind the counter, watching him with sunken eyes. "Bad night for driving," the attendant muttered, not looking away. "Yeah," Daniel replied, forcing a small chuckle. "This storm's brutal." The old man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly slid a piece of paper across the counter. Daniel frowned and picked it up. His stomach twisted. It was a missing person flyer. The face on it looked eerily familiar. The same hollow eyes, the sharp cheekbones. It was the figure he had seen on the road. "When did he go missing?" Daniel asked. The old man exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Long time ago." Daniel put the flyer down and left without another word. Back in his truck, he tried to shake the unease creeping up his spine. The road stretched endlessly before him, the snowstorm thickening. He checked the time. It was nearly 3 in the morning. He had been driving for over an hour, yet he kept seeing the same trees, the same broken road signs. The gas station had disappeared behind him, swallowed by the snow. He flicked on the radio again. The static crackled. Then a voice whispered through the speaker. "Daniel!" His blood turned to ice. He turned the dial frantically, but the voice only grew louder, overlapping with it, whispering his name over and over. His breath came fast, fogging up the wind. As he reached out to wipe it, his hand froze. There were symbols drawn in the frost, symbols he had never seen before. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then he saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading from the trees toward his truck. But there was no one there. His shaking fingers reached for the gear shift, ready to get the hell out of there. But before he could move, the truck shut off. Everything went silent. The wind howled outside, rocking the cab. He gripped the wheel, scanning the darkness. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. A face staring back at him. His own face. His breath caught in his throat. He turned, but there was nothing. The whispering on the radio grew frantic, voices overlapping in a chorus of dread. He yanked the door handle and stumbled out into the snow, his boots crunching against the ice. The air was deathly still. Then he heard it. The sound of footsteps behind him. He turned. A figure stood just feet away, barely visible through the snow. As the wind cleared for a brief moment, Daniel saw its face clearly. It was him, pale, frozen, lips twisted in a silent scream. Daniel's mind shattered. The snow swirled violently around him and the world tilted. More figures emerged from the storm. Dozens of them, all identical to him, all staring. Then they moved. A deafening howl filled the night as they rushed toward him, swallowing him in the blinding white. Days later, another trucker pulled into the same gas station, shivering from the cold. The old man behind the counter sighed and slid a new missing person flyer across the counter. Daniel's face stared back from the paper. Another one lost to the snow. The storm had been relentless for hours, turning the road into a swirling nightmare of white. Riley gripped the steering wheel of his SUV, his knuckles aching from the tension. He had been heading home after visiting his parents in the next state over, but the blizzard had swallowed the highway, forcing him to take a remote back road through the mountains. His gas tank was dangerously low, and the snow showed no sign of stopping. He checked his phone. No signal. Just endless, suffocating static. The storm had knocked out everything. His headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall. But as he rounded a bend, his breath caught in his throat. A woman stood in the middle of the road. She wore a tattered winter coat, her long hair hanging wet and frozen around her face. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if her neck had been twisted too far. Riley slammed the brakes, his tires skidding on the ice. When he looked back up, she was gone. His pulse pounded. He had no choice but to keep driving. Stopping meant freezing to death. The road ahead seemed endless, the snow piling up so fast he could barely make out the tracks behind him. He needed gas, a place to wait out the storm. anything. Then, out of nowhere, a neon sign flickered through the storm. Lakeview Lodge, vacancy. Relief flooded him. He hadn't seen this place on any map, but right now it didn't matter. He pulled into the snow-covered lot, his SUV nearly sliding into a lamppost. The lodge was old, its wooden walls weathered and darkened by time. The front door creaked as he stepped inside. The lobby was eerily quiet. A dimly lit fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A bell sat on the counter, tarnished with age. Riley rang it. A man appeared from the back office, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes seemed off, like he wasn't looking directly at Riley, but rather through him. Long night, the man said in a monotone. Yeah, the storm's brutal. I just need a room for the night, Riley replied, rubbing his arms against the cold that seemed to linger in the building. The man slid a rusted key across the counter. Room 6. Riley took it and headed down the dim hallway. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots, the walls lined with faded paintings of frozen lakes and dense forests. The place smelled old, dusty, with a faint hint of something metallic. His room was simple, a small bed, a window overlooking nothing but swirling snow. A single chair sat in the corner, oddly positioned as if someone had just been sitting there. Exhaustion weighed on him, but as he lay in bed, something felt wrong. The storm outside howled like a living thing, but inside, it was unnervingly silent. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate, right outside his door. Riley sat up, his breath shallow. Hello? No response, just another knock. His fingers gripped the sheets as he forced himself to stand. He crept to the door, hesitated, then yanked it open. The hallway was empty, but the chair in the corner of his room was now facing the bed. The blood drained from his face. The air turned frigid. He could see his breath. Then, in the reflection of the window, he saw something standing behind him. The woman, the one from the road. Her head still twisted, her lips moving without sound. Then, darkness. The next morning, the storm had calmed. The lodge was silent, empty. Riley's SUV was still parked outside, its doors wide open, snow piling into the driver's seat. His footprints led into the building, but none ever came out. The snowstorm had been relentless, pounding the small mountain road with thick waves of white. Emily kept her hands tight on the steering wheel, her breath fogging up the windshield despite the heater blasting on high. She had been driving for hours, desperately trying to make it to her sister's house before nightfall. But now, lost somewhere in the storm, she wasn't sure if she'd ever make it at all. Her phone had lost signal nearly an hour ago, and the road signs were buried under the ever-growing snow. The world outside was a featureless void of white, swallowing the road ahead. She hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. Then, through the swirling storm, she spotted something ahead. A house. It sat alone, deep in the woods, its windows glowing with a soft, golden light. A flickering neon sign near the porch barely clung to life. Maplewood Inn. Vacancy. Emily exhaled in relief. A place to wait out the storm. She pulled into the snow-covered driveway, her tires crunching over the ice. The house was old but well-maintained, its dark wooden exterior standing strong against the weather. The moment she stepped inside, warmth enveloped her. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, the scent of burning wood thick in the air. The lobby was small but cozy, with antique furniture and faded wallpaper, giving it an eerie, timeless feel. At the front desk sat a woman, an older lady with silver hair and hollow eyes. You came in from the storm, the woman said, her voice oddly distant. Yeah, Emily replied, brushing snow from her coat. I didn't think I'd make it much farther. The woman nodded slowly. Not many do. Emily frowned at the strange comment. But before she could question it, the woman slid an old-fashioned brass key across the counter. Room 3. Last one on the left. Emily hesitated before picking it up. The key was ice cold. She made her way down the dimly lit hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. The walls were lined with old, faded painting, scenic landscapes covered in thick layers of snow, eerily similar to the storm outside. Her room was simple, a large bed, a dresser with a dusty mirror, a single window overlooking the forest beyond. As soon as she closed the door behind her, the silence settled in, an unnatural stillness. The only sound was the wind howling outside. Then, she noticed something. There were footprints in the snow outside her window. She stepped closer, peering out through the frost-covered glass. The footprints were deep, leading from the edge of the woods to just beneath her window, but they didn't lead away. A cold dread settled in her stomach. There was no way someone had walked up to her window in this storm and simply vanished. A whisper brushed against her ear. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around. No one was there. Her heart pounded. She swore she had felt someone standing right behind. Then, knocking, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the closet. Emily's chest tightened. The air in the room felt heavier. colder. She took a cautious step toward the closet, her fingers trembling as she reached for the hand. The door creaked open, nothing but darkness. She exhaled sharply, letting out a nervous laugh. She was just tired. The storm was playing tricks on her mind. Then, just as she turned away, a hand reached out from the darkness. She screamed, stumbling backward. The hand was pale, thin, and wrong, its fingers too long, its nails blackened and cracked. Then, the whisper returned, but this time, it was clear. You were never supposed to find them. The lights flickered, the walls groaned, the air filled with the scent of something rotting. Emily lunged for the door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, more voices, layers upon layers of all speaking at once. She turned, and the mirror reflected something that wasn't her. A figure stood in her place. Its eyes were hollow. Its mouth was open in a silent scream. Its skin was frozen, frostbitten, peeling away. Then, the lights went out. The next morning, the storm had settled. The Maplewood Inn stood as it always had, silent, untouched. But room 3 was empty. The bed was untouched. The brass key still sat on the front desk. And outside the window in the fresh layer of snow were a new set of footprints, leading into the woods. The snowstorm had turned deadly. Ethan's car crawled along the desolate mountain road, its tires struggling for grip on the icy pavement. He had been driving for hours, his gas tank dangerously low, and his phone signal long gone. The world outside was a swirling void of white, the storm suffocating everything in sight. Then, just as he began to think he'd have to sleep in his car, he saw it, a gas station. It appeared suddenly through the storm, its flickering neon sign barely visible under the layers of snow. Last stop gas. Relief flooded Ethan. He pulled into the station, parking next to the only pump. The place looked old, almost abandoned. Snow piled against the windows, and the lights inside cast a dim, sickly yellow glow. Stepping out into the freezing wind, he pulled his coat tighter. The air smelled strange, like something damp and rotting beneath the snow. He walked toward the small convenience store attached to the station. As he reached for the door handle, a thought struck him. Where was the attendant? There were no other cars, no footprints in the snow, just the silent station waiting. He pushed the door open. A bell jingled overhead. Inside, the air was stale and unnervingly warm. Shelves were half-stocked with dust-covered snacks. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds. Then, from behind the counter, a voice. "You shouldn't be here," Ethan startled. A man stood behind the register. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes were wrong, unfocused, as if staring at something just beyond Ethan. I need gas," Ethan stammered. "And if you have a phone, mine's dead." The man didn't blink. "There's no way out," he said flatly. Ethan frowned. "What?" The man's lips trembled, like he wanted to say something else but couldn't. Then, with slow, jerky movements, he reached beneath the counter and slid a key toward Ethan. "For the pump," he said. Ethan hesitated before taking it. The key was ice cold. He hurried outside, the storm pressing in around him. The wind howled like a living thing. As he reached his car, something made him stop. There were footprints in the snow. They led from the gas station's entrance to the side of the building, but there were no footprints leading away. Ethan's breath came faster. He forced himself to turn back toward the pump, jamming the key into the lock. As the gas started flowing, he glanced toward the darkened side of the station. Something moved. A figure, tall, wrong, its limbs too long, was standing just beyond the station's light, watching. Ethan's chest tightened. The gas pump clicked off. He fumbled with the nozzle, his hands trembling. Then, from behind him, a whisper. "You need to leave." Ethan spun. The station attendant stood directly behind him, too close. His face was different now, distorted, blurred. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in quick gasps. He yanked open his car door, throwing himself inside and slamming it shut. As he started the engine, his headlights illuminated the snow-covered road ahead, and standing there, directly in his path, were at least a dozen figures, pale, motionless, staring. Ethan's scream caught in his throat. He slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning on the ice. The figures didn't move. They just watched. He swerved around them, his headlights flickering as if the storm itself was trying to consume him. His heart pounded as he pushed the car forward, faster, away from the gas station. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood turned to ice. The station was gone. The road behind him was untouched, as if he had never been there at all. The snowstorm had swallowed everything. Matt's SUV crawled along the deserted highway, the wipers barely keeping up with the thick flakes hammering against the windshield. He had been driving for hours, trying to reach his parents' cabin before nightfall. But now, lost in the storm with no cell signal, he wasn't sure if he'd ever get there. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw something ahead, a motel. Its neon sign flickered weakly. "Pine Hollow Inn." Relief flooded him, a place to wait out the storm. He pulled into the snow-covered lot, noticing immediately how empty it was. No other cars, no footprints leading to the entrance, just the quiet hum of the flickering sign and the relentless wind. The moment he stepped inside, warmth surrounded him. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting long, flickering shadows. At the front desk stood a man. His uniform was neat but outdated, his expression unreadable. His skin was pale, almost too smooth, and his dark eyes never seemed to blink. "You're lucky," the man said. "We have one room left." Matt hesitated. Something about this place felt off, but exhaustion weighed on him, and the storm outside wasn't letting up. He nodded. "I'll take it." The man handed him an old-fashioned brass key. "Room 6. As Matt turned to leave, the man spoke again. "If someone knocks, don't answer." Matt froze. "Excuse me?" The man only smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Unnerved, Matt took the key and hurried down the hallway. The motel felt impossibly quiet, the only sound his boots against the wooden floor. The hallway smelled of dust and something faintly rotten. His room was small but warm. A simple bed, a nightstand, an old dresser with a mirror. A single window overlooked the parking lot, now barely visible through the heavy snow. He locked the door, exhaling deeply. He just needed to rest for a few hours. Then he'd be back on the road. Then, a knock. Software. Deliberate. Matt's blood ran cold. His pulse hammered as he slowly turned toward the door. Another knock. He swallowed. It was impossible. He had just walked down the hallway. He hadn't heard anyone else check in. He stepped closer, heart pounding. "Hello?" Silence. He moved to the peephole and hesitated before looking through. No one was there. A chill crept up his spine. Maybe he was imagining. The storm had his nerves shot. Then, the knock came again. Closer. Matt stepped back, breath hitching. He grabbed his phone, but there was still no signal. His hands trembled as he checked the window. The parking lot was empty. Then, he saw it. Footprints. In the fresh snow, leading directly from the woods to his window. But there were no footprints leading away. A shadow moved. Not outside. Inside. Matt spun. The closet door was open. It had been closed when he entered. His breath came in short gasps. The air in the room felt heavier, colder. The fireplace crackled louder, like it was struggling to stay alive. Then, a whisper, low, raspy, right behind him. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered. The air turned ice cold. Matt lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock. The knocking grew louder, faster, frantic. Then, silence. Everything stopped. He turned, shaking. The closet was empty. The footprints outside were gone. The air was warm again. Had he imagined it? His body trembled as he collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to think. He just needed to sleep. In the morning, he'd leave. As he closed his eyes, he didn't see the closet door, slowly creaking open. The next morning, Pine Hollow Inn stood silent. The room keys remained on the counter. The fireplace had burned out. Matt's car was still parked outside, its windows frosted over. But room 6 was empty, as if no one had ever stayed there at all. The snowstorm had turned vicious, a swirling white abyss swallowing the road ahead. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. She had been driving through the back roads for hours, trying to reach her friend's cabin before dark. But now, with her phone dead and the road barely visible, she knew she was hopelessly lost. Then, through the blizzard, she spotted something, a house. It stood alone at the edge of the forest, its shape barely visible through the falling snow. A faint glow spilled from one of the windows, a sign of life in the endless white void. With no other options, she turned onto the narrow driveway, tires crunching over ice. The house was old but sturdy. Its wooden exterior was darkened with age, icicles hanging from the eaves like jagged teeth. The wind howled through the trees behind her, pushing her forward. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, her fingers already numb from the cold. Silence. She knocked again. The door creaked open on its own. The warm air inside was almost suffocating after the bitter cold. The house was lit by the soft glow of oil lamp, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The air smelled of firewood and something else, something sweet, but faintly sour under. "Hello," she called, stepping inside. No answer. She hesitated. The house felt lived in. A fire burned low in the fireplace, and a coat hung by the door. A dinner table was set for one. Someone had to be here. Then, from deeper inside the house, a creaking sound. Her breath hitched. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway ahead. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor. An old woman. She stood still, half hidden in the dim light, her thin frame wrapped in a heavy shawl. Her face was shadowed, her eyes deep and unreadable. "You should not have come," the woman said softly. Sarah took a step back. I'm sorry. I just got lost in the storm. My car, they know you're here now." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Who?" The woman's lips trembled as if she wanted to say more. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she turned and disappeared down the hallway. Sarah shivered. The house suddenly felt colder. A loud bang made her jump. The front door slammed shut. She ran to it, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were old-fashioned, heavy iron mechanisms that wouldn't turn. Her breath fogged in the cold air. Then footsteps. Not the woman. Heavy. Uneven. Coming from upstairs. Sarah turned slowly, her heart pounding. At the top of the staircase stood a figure. Tall. Wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers clawed and twitching. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if trying to see her from an impossible angle. Then it moved. Fast. Sarah stumbled back, crashing into a table. A lamp shattered on the floor, the shadows stretching wildly. She turned and ran, bolting toward the hallway where the woman had disappeared. The walls groaned. The air felt thick, suffocating. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the thing coming. Sarah threw herself into the first door she found, slamming it shut. She was in a bedroom. Old, dust-covered furniture, a large oval mirror in the corner. The storm raged outside the window, the wind screaming. Then, a whisper. Not outside, not in the hallway. Inside the room. She turned slowly toward the mirror. Her reflection was wrong. It was smiling. She wasn't. Her breath hitched. Her reflection took a step forward, but she hadn't moved. Then, it reached out. The glass shattered. A hand, cold, clawed, too many fingers, lunged from the broken mirror. Sarah screamed. Darkness swallowed her. The next morning, the storm had passed. The forest was silent. The old house stood just as it always had. Alone, abandoned. Sarah's car sat in the driveway untouched, but the house was empty. Only the broken mirror reflecting the room. And deep within the shattered glass, Sarah's reflection was still there, watching, smiling, waiting. The snowstorm had turned the world into an endless white void, erasing the road, the sky, and everything around James as he drove through the back roads. He had no idea where he was. His GPS had stopped working miles ago, and his phone had no signal. Then, just as panic started creeping in, he saw the figure. A man stood in the middle of the road, barely visible through the swirling snow. He didn't move, didn't wave for help, just stood there, motionless. James slammed the brakes, his tires skidding on the icy pavement. His heart pounded. The figure still didn't move. James hesitated before slowly rolling down his window. "Hey, you okay?" No answer. The man was tall, wearing a long black coat, his face hidden beneath the hood. The way he stood, it wasn't right. Too stiff, too still. A deep unease crept into James's stomach. Then, the man took a step forward. James didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas, swerving around the figure. His car fishtailed on the ice before regaining control. He checked the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. The man was gone. James's breath came fast and uneven. He knew he had seen someone. There was no way he imagined. Then, something moved in the back seat. A whisper of fabric. A shift in weight. James froze. His hands clenched the steering wheel. His pulse hammered in his throat. Slowly, heart pounding, he turned his head. A figure sat in the back seat. The same man from the road. James's scream was lost in the roar of the wind. He yanked the wheel in blind terror, the car skidding off the road. The world spun as he crashed through the snowbank, the car slamming into the trees. Silence. The storm raged outside, but inside everything was still. James's vision blurred as he fought to stay conscious. Blood dripped down his forehead. The back seat was empty. The man was gone. James forced himself to move. He reached for his phone, still no signal. The car was wrecked, half buried in snow. He needed to find shelter before he froze to death. Then, through the storm, he saw it. A small cabin. It stood just beyond the trees, barely visible through the whiteout. Warm light flickered from the windows. With no other choice, James stumbled toward it. His legs felt heavy, his body screaming in pain, but he forced himself forward. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth. The scent of wood smoke filled the air. Then, James saw something that made his blood run cold. A table, set for two. A plate of steaming food sat on each side, as if someone had been waiting for him. The chair opposite him creaked. James turned slowly. A figure sat across from him, the man in the black coat. Only now, James could see his face. It was his own. The man smiled. The cabin's door slammed shut. The next morning, the storm cleared. A rescue team searching the back roads found James's car, half buried in snow. The driver's seat was empty. There were no footprints leading away, only a single set of frozen handprints on the inside of the windshield. The snowstorm had turned brutal, the wind howling like a wounded animal as I struggled to keep my car on the narrow mountain road. The headlights barely cut through the swirling white abyss, and my gas tank was dangerously low. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. My GPS had stopped working miles ago, and there hadn't been another car in sight for at least an hour. Then, through the thick snowfall, I saw a sign. Everwood Lodge, 2 miles ahead. Relief flooded me, a place to wait out the storm. I pressed forward, my car groaning as it climbed the icy road. Soon, the dark outline of a large lodge appeared through the blizzard. It looked old, but well kept, its windows glowing warmly against the night. I pulled into the lot, noticing something strange. There were no other cars. A place this remote should have been packed with stranded travelers. I hesitated, but the cold creeping into my bones left me little choice. Inside, the lodge was eerily quiet. The lobby had a rustic charm, wood-paneled walls, a crackling fireplace, and the faint scent of a large wooden desk sat near the entrance, but no one was behind it. Then, as I stepped forward, a bell rang. The sound sent a shiver through me. It hadn't come from the desk. From deeper inside the lodge, a door creaked open. A man emerged wearing an old-fashioned suit, his hair neatly combed back. His skin was too pale, his smile too perfect. "You made it just in time," he said smoothly. "The storm's only getting worse." His voice was calm, but something about it felt wrong. I forced a smile. "Do you have any rooms available?" He slid a key across the desk. "Room 303. I hesitated. "Don't you need my information?" His smile didn't falter. "We already have it." A chill ran through me, but I was too tired to argue. The elevator doors slid open as soon as I approached, as if it had been waiting. The third floor was eerily silent. The hallway stretched on forever, the air thick with a strange stillness. Room 303 was at the very end. As I unlocked the door, a strange thought struck me. I hadn't seen a single other guest. Inside, the room was warm, almost too warm. The bed was neatly made, the window half covered with frost. Then, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the bedside table next to the lamp sat a photograph of me, taken tonight. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. Had someone followed me? Was this a sick joke? Then, from inside the closet, I heard it, a soft, rasping breath. I froze. My skin went ice cold. Something was. I backed toward the door, but before I could move, the closet door creaked open. The lights flickered. A figure stood inside, not moving, not breathing. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine, it whispered, "You checked in? You can't leave." The lights went out. The last thing I remember was screaming. The next morning, the storm had passed. Everwood Lodge stood silent in the morning light. A man pulled into the empty parking lot, looking for shelter. Inside, the front desk bell rang. The clerk appeared, smiling. "You made it just in time." And behind the counter, hanging neatly on the wall, was a new photograph of me. The snowstorm was relentless, a swirling white nightmare that devoured everything in sight. I had been driving for hours, my hands stiff on the wheel, my nerves stretched thin. The heater in my truck struggled against the cold, barely keeping the frost from creeping onto the inside of the windshield. I wasn't supposed to be on this road. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere back on the highway, and now I was deep in unfamiliar back road, miles away from the nearest town. My phone had lost service long ago, and the only sign of civilization was a dimly lit gas station just off the road ahead. I pulled in, relieved. The station looked old, too old, the kind of place that belonged in a different time, untouched by modern life. The single pump was rusted, the sign above it swaying in the wind. The lights inside the small convenience store flickered. A neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window. I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something rotten. Shelves stood half empty, stocked with outdated snacks and strange, unfamiliar brands. The cooler hummed softly, filled with bottles of soda I didn't recognize. Everything looked wrong, like a place frozen in time. Then I saw the attendant. He stood behind the counter, still as a statue. His clothes were too clean, too stiff, as if they had never been worn before. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips curled into a smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Long drive, he asked. His voice was off, hollow, like an old recording played from a broken speaker. "Yeah," I muttered, and got lost in the storm. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It wasn't moving. "You should hurry," he said, still smiling. "They'll be coming soon." A chill ran through me. "Who?" The attendant's smile widened. "The others." I turned toward the door and froze. Through the large front window, figures were emerging from the storm. Tall, shadowy shapes, moving too smoothly, not walking, gliding. My breath caught in my throat. There were dozens of them, their hollow faces barely visible through the swirling snow. The attendant's voice dropped to a whisper. "You shouldn't have stopped." The lights flickered. A deep, low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones. The figures were closer now, their heads tilting unnaturally. The glass door rattled. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran, bursting through the door and into the freezing night. The wind screamed, My truck was only feet away, but the shadows were faster. I could hear them whispering, words I didn't understand, voices leaking into my mind like cold fingers. I reached my truck, yanking the door open. A hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned, my stomach lurching. The gas station attendant was right behind me. "You can't leave," he whispered. His eyes, they weren't human anymore. I screamed. Somehow I got the truck started. Tires spun on the ice as I slammed the gas. My headlights cut through the storm, illuminating the road ahead. But in the rearview mirror, the gas station was gone. Nothing but untouched snow, where it had been seconds ago. No sign of the building, no sign of the figures, nothing. I drove until the storm broke, until I saw the first real gas station in the distance, a place that existed. But even now, even in the safety of daylight, I know the truth. That road wasn't empty. It never was. The snowstorm had turned the world into an endless, swirling white, the kind of storm that erased everything: roads, landmarks, even time itself. I had been driving for what felt like hours, my headlights barely piercing through the thick snowfall. The wind screamed against my car, rattling the windows like desperate fingers trying to get inside. I shouldn't have been out there, but I had no choice. My sister Emma had called me in a panic, her voice trembling over the phone. "Something's wrong. Please, just get here." Then, the line went dead. She lived in a remote cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be her quiet retreat, her escape from the chaos of city life. But something had changed, and now I was driving straight into it. I finally spotted the turnoff, barely visible under the thick layer of snow. The road leading to her cabin was narrow, lined with tall, skeletal trees swaying violently in the wind. My tires struggled against the ice as I made my way up the path, the storm pressing against me. Then I saw it, the cabin. The lights inside flickered weakly, the windows nearly covered in frost, but something was. The front door was wide open. A pit formed in my stomach. I killed the engine and stepped out, the cold slamming into me like a wall. "Emma!" I shouted over the. No answer. I forced myself forward, my boots sinking into the deep snow. The porch groaned beneath my weight as I stepped inside. The cabin was freezing. The fireplace was out, and the air was thick with a strange, metallic scent. A single lamp cast long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Then I saw the footprints, leading from the doorway, tracking snow deeper inside, not just Emma's, someone else's. I followed them, my pulse hammering. They led down the hallway, stopping just outside Emma's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beyond it. I pushed it open and froze. Emma was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. Her back was, her long hair hanging limply over her shoulders. But she wasn't moving. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't even breathing. I stepped forward, my voice barely a whisper. "Emma?" Her head twitched, just slightly, the kind of movement that wasn't natural, slow, stiff, wrong. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite hers, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." A deep, cold terror settled in my bones. Then, I saw something. The closet door. It was open just a crack, and from the darkness inside, something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. A presence, a weight in the air, thick and suffocating. And then, Emma turned her head all the way around. Bones cracked. Her face wasn't her face anymore. Her eyes were wrong, hollow. A voice that wasn't hers rasped from her throat. "You brought it with you." The closet door creaked open wider. Something stepped out. The lights flickered. And the last thing I remember was screaming. The next morning, the storm had passed. Rescue teams found the cabin, empty. No footprints in the snow. No sign of Emma. Only one thing remained. The closet door, still open, waiting. The snowstorm had turned vicious, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The road stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by white, and my wiper struggled against the ice building on the windshield. I had no business being out in this, but my job as a delivery driver didn't care about blizzards. My last stop of the night was a small, isolated house deep in the countryside, far from any town, far from any help. The GPS led me down a narrow road flanked by dark, looming trees. The snow had piled high on either side, making the path feel too tight, too claustrophobic. I checked the address again. The house I was looking for wasn't on any maps. I should have turned around, but I didn't. The house appeared out of nowhere, barely visible through the storm. A tall, thin structure with warped wooden siding and a roof, weighed down by thick layers of ice. There were no lights on, no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life at all. But someone had placed an order. I grabbed the package and made my way to the porch, my boots crunching in the deep snow. The air was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, that made you feel like you weren't alone even when you couldn't see anyone. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. The door swung open. Not all the way, just a few inches. Just enough for a thin sliver of darkness to seep out from within. "Hello," I called, stepping back. Delivery! Silence. A gust of wind pushed at my back, urging me forward. Against my better judgment, I leaned in just enough to glance inside. The hallway was dark, stretching deeper into the house like a gaping throat. I don't know why, but I took a step inside. The floorboards creaked beneath me and my breath came out in shaky clouds. I placed the package just inside the door. About to turn back, then I saw it. Footprints, not in the snow, on the ceiling. A trail of damp, bare footprints, leading further into the house. I bolted. I spun around, rushing back toward my truck, my boots slipping on the ice. I didn't care. I had to get out. I yanked the door open and jumped inside, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The engine roared to life and I hit the gas. As I sped away, my headlights illuminated something in the rearview mirror. The house. The door was closed, and in the upstairs window, a figure stood, tall, watching, its head tilted too far, its mouth hanging open, too wide. Something was in that house, something that had been waiting, and now it knew my face. The snowstorm had swallowed everything, the road, the trees, even the sky. My headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall as I crawled along the winding mountain road. I was heading to a remote cabin my friend Jake had rented for the weekend. He had invited a few of us, but one by one, everyone canceled because of the storm, except me. I should have turned back, but I didn't. By the time I reached the cabin, the storm was howling like a living thing, slamming against the wooden structure. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by an endless forest buried in ice. The windows were dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. Something felt wrong. I knocked, but there was no answer. I tried the handle, unlocked. Inside, the air was freezing. The fireplace was out, and the whole place smelled damp and stale, like it hadn't been used in years. Jake, I called, stepping inside. Silence. Then, a soft creak from the hallway. I turned, my breath catching. Jake stood at the end of the hall. His clothes were wrinkled, his face pale, his hair damp like he had just come in from the storm. But his eyes were wrong. Wide, empty, like he wasn't really seeing me. "Dude, you okay?" I asked, forcing a laugh. He didn't respond, just stared. Then, his lips parted, and in a voice that wasn't quite his, he whispered, "It let you in." A chill ran through me, deeper than the cold. "What?" I stepped forward, but he suddenly backed away. His whole body jerked unnaturally, like a puppet being yanked on strings. His head twitched to the side, and his lips stretched into a grin that was too wide, too forced. "You shouldn't have come." The lights flickered. A shadow moved in the hallway behind, but there was no one else here. Then, Jake turned and ran. Not into the living room, not outside. He ran into the bedroom closet and slammed the door shut. The entire cabin went silent. Only the wind howled outside, pressing against the walls, like something trying to get in. I swallowed hard, stepping forward. "Jake?" No answer. The closet door creaked open, just an inch, just enough for me to see the darkness inside, and the two glowing eyes staring back at me. Jake's voice came from the closet, but it was wrong, twisted, echoing. "It let you in, but it won't let you leave." The lights went out, and something stepped toward me.